Welcome to Like Minded with Dr. Patrice. Each episode, we'll be sitting down with different types of experts and unpacking the role of mental health in our day-to-day lives. My name is Dr. Patrice Lagoy. I'm an international psychologist, licensed marriage and family therapist, and former entertainment executive. This episode, we will be discussing intergenerational trauma and healing. My guest today is Dr. Yanira Hernandez, LCSW. Dr. Hernandez is a bilingual and bicultural licensed clinical social worker, educator, speaker, consultant, founder of Palante Therapy Incorporated. She centers her work with BIPOC individuals with an emphasis on Latinx communities. Welcome, Dr. Hernandez.
Hi,
So nice
thank
to
you
have
for having
you.
me.
So I really want to talk to you about just kind of, for our listeners, talking about what is intergenerational trauma. When we talk about that, what does that mean? What are you seeing with the clients that you are serving?
Yeah, so intergenerational trauma are the biological, social, mental, emotional wounds
Mm-hmm.
that have been transmitted or passed down from generation to generation,
Mm-hmm.
right? And these wounds either can come out as cultural messages, behavior, beliefs,
Yes.
attitudes, that stem from a single event, for example, like sexual abuse trauma or neglect, abandonment, death of a loved one or
Yes.
family member. And if it's not processed, then it gets passed on to their child, right?
Yes.
Or we can also see historical trauma, right? Where there's a collective trauma event that affects a whole community.
Yes.
For example, slavery,
Mhm.
colonization, colonial violence,
Yes.
right? Displacement. So then if a whole community doesn't process that, it continues to get passed down,
Yes.
and we can definitely see that in so many communities of color.
Absolutely.
Right. And in the work that I do, I specifically work with first generation Latinx individuals. I work with a lot with undocumented and immigrant communities. And one of the things that I see are elements of intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
Right. Sometimes they are aware that there has been intergenerational patterns that have been passed down, and sometimes they're not.
Yeah.
Usually they'll come in and see like, oh, I want to work on, my perfectionism, right? Which is one of the things that we tend to see with intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
And when we start kind of unlayering where that perfectionism comes from, oftentimes it comes from intergenerational trauma.
Yes.
Is the beliefs that I need to be perfect. I cannot
Twice as
afford to
good.
fail, right? I
Yes.
can't afford to fail, especially if you're a person of color.
Yes.
That's perhaps never been an option in your family.
Yes.
Right. And when we start tracing it, even with our parents, perhaps they received messages that they couldn't fail.
Yes.
Right. And if they did, there was going to be perhaps physical consequences to that. Right. And then if we trace it even back, perhaps there's more to that.
Yes.
Right. So we start to see a lot of the legacy burdens, a lot of the cultural burdens that have been passed down from generations to generations, and the specific impact that it does on you, on how it shows up. Because it can manifest in so many different ways.
Right. And it's interesting because it's also one of those things, like this is so complex because it's not a bad thing to say you need to work hard, being successful. There's not maybe going to be a lot of opportunities for you. And so you always have to do your best, right? And then at what point do you see how that becomes something that is maladaptive? And now I have this burden on myself versus you can do it, you can work hard, you can succeed. How do you have that conversation with people where it's not that we're trying to demonize the original message, but it's not working anymore? Like it's created more of a burden than it's been helpful.
Right. And I think that's kind of the duality that I oftentimes kind of like to point out, because on one hand, we can appreciate, right, where it comes from. For a lot of our parents, it's like, you need to work hard, and you need to continue to hustle, right? No, it's not an option, right? So you kind of realize that for a lot of our parents, that those were survival messages, right? Because they wanted us to survive perhaps in institutions that were not historically designed for people of color or people who look like us. So it makes sense. It has served its purpose to survive. At the same time, right? Understanding the psychological and the emotional impact that those messages carry. For a lot of us, we've heard those messages from childhood, right? Of like, if you get straight A's, you'll be able to get into the college that you want to.
And then you'll get the good job.
And then you get the good job.
Retire from there and live
Absolutely.
successfully. Yes,
It looks very
exactly.
linear.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But for a lot of our parents, that's how they knew, that pathway. Now, we're adult children who have difficulty resting, who thrive of consistently producing, right? We are perfectionists, perhaps have high levels of anxiety, right? Have difficulty processing emotions, have difficulty being in relationships, right? Perhaps may navigate shame, right? People pleasing, right? It manifests in so many ways, right? So being able to take notice of like, wow, what has served me and what also has impacted me, the way I show up in the world, the way I show up with individuals, right? And specifically, how you show up in specific spaces, right? Because for example, if as a Latina myself, child of immigrants, first generation, eldest daughter, and
Ooh, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, right? My intersection identities are very layered, right? So then if I walk into a space where I don't see people who look like me, naturally I'm going to want to work harder, want to strive for perfection.
Because you are the example.
Because I am the example. So now I carry that burden, right? And of course, if I receive the messages that, mija, you got to keep trying, you got to work hard, you got to hustle, then that's all I'm going to do.
Yes.
Right? There is no such thing as resting.
That is something that we definitely need to talk about, like that inability that people have to rest.
Right.
And you mentioned, going back a little bit, you mentioned perfectionism being one of the things that people can struggle with. You were talking a little bit about shame. Can you go into that a little bit more, how you see that manifesting?
Yeah. So shame, a lot of it can manifest as a result of like, perhaps not understanding what you're navigating, your emotions, right? But noticing that there's an internal conflict going on, right? It's like, I feel this way, but I also feel this way, especially if you come from a bicultural identity, right? Because a part of you wants to kind of lean into like your ancestry of those kind of cultural, woven messages and just the lineage that you have, the cultural lineage. And you're like, I want to be able to have that aspect of me, that part of the identity, while also navigating, well, what's expected of me as being someone who is perhaps first generation in the US, and what cultural messages do I receive from that, right? And sometimes we're consistently navigating this shame of like, I'm not good enough for this, but I'm also not good enough for that. And that can cause a lot of shame, because if you go on one end, especially for bicultural families, it's like, oh, like you're one of those, like you've been more Americanized, or you kind of don't belong here. But then you go on the other side and like, oh, you don't look like us, so you don't belong here either. So it's like, where do I go? Right. So it's kind of really navigating the shame that comes from it. And I see that often, working a lot with BIPOC individuals who are often bicultural and just kind of having to navigate that. Right. So
absolutely. Where you were mentioning how things like sexual trauma also can lead to kind of intergenerational ramifications. What do you see in clients and like with people you work with in terms of that? Because it's almost another category, right? Because it happens in all families, but maybe it shows up differently in communities of color.
Absolutely. One way that I've seen tied to sexual abuse trauma, not only in the work that I do, but I see it even in the conversations that I have with individuals and even in my own family, is secrecy. Secrecy is something that has been tied to it. It's a ramification of intergenerational trauma. If you really think about historically, we've been told that you can speak up. Right. Just keep it under the rug. Right.
Don't tell everyone's business.
Don't tell everyone's business.
Right.
And that's something that is very, very true to a lot of communities of color. Right. And so when we experience there is a something like sexual abuse in the family, right, and you've been taught that you can't share something like that, you're going to withhold that information. Right. And you're going to continue to not share and not process what happened. So then therefore, if you have children, right, you're not having these conversations about the body. You're not about the importance of boundaries, physical boundaries, right? So then if your child is also, experienced sexual abuse, then there is no conversation ever
That's right.
happening.
Yes, they've gotten the message that either it doesn't happen
It
or we
doesn't
don't talk
happen
about
or
it.
we don't talk about it. And
Yes.
I see that so often
Mhm.
in communities of color, and especially in the communities that I work with in Latinx communities,
Mhm.
right? This aspect of secrecy, right?
Yes.
And once the secret is out, if it's out, there's a lot of shame tied to that,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? It's like you brought shame to our family and
Yes.
now we're being ostracized,
Yes.
from extended family, because this big secret is out. So I would have
Mhm.
rather not talked about it.
Well, and like Dr. Hernandez too, you wonder, how much of that kind of continuing that shame cycle is because I've experienced that as well. And then, so now I feel bad about it. I, I know that you feel bad, like, and so I don't want to talk about it with you either, right? And so it's just continuing that cycle, right? Like, how do you advise people to move past that, or to understand where it comes from? Like, maybe at one point, privacy, secrecy was also something that was helpful and valuable, and in this situation, it's really harmful. How do you talk to people about that?
Yeah. So one of the things that I usually kind of invite my clients to really check in, how is their body responding?
Mm,
And I think our bodies are just such tellers of like how we should function,
yes.
right? Oftentimes, uh, we feel a discomfort, but we ignore it, right? We
Hmm.
ignore it because of pressures or
Yes,
because of we've been taught to
that's
hide what
right.
we feel,
Hmm.
right? Or sometimes that out of body experience, right? Where we're not in tune with how our body is feeling,
Hmm.
right? Especially in the case of trauma,
Hmm.
right? So one of the things that I help my clients is being able to lean into what their body is telling them,
Mm,
right? And especially as they're having those conversations for the first time with me, or they're disclosing either sexual abuse trauma or any type of trauma,
yeah.
right? I kind of pause because sometimes it's very easy to narrate the
Hmm.
story,
Mm,
right? So
hmm.
then I was like, okay, hold that. Let's go back and let's lean into the body.
Yes.
What, how is your body speaking to you right now? Where
Hmm.
are you feeling it? And then we start doing more kind of somatic work.
Yes,
And then they realize, wow, I didn't realize I was holding that much.
that's right.
And I've been telling the story like, 20 times and
Hmm.
I've never reacted this way. I
Yes.
said, or this part has never made me cry. And now they find themselves crying because their
Yes.
body is finally releasing and now
Yes.
they're finally attuning to that. So that's
Yeah.
usually where I kind of like to start off because I understand that this is not a one session thing. This is something that we're going to
Unfortunately, it's
continue
not. No, we gotta
to
dig in.
process and
Yes.
understand,
Yeah.
right? And a lot of it comes from there. Is really being able to check in.
Hmm.
Well, what part of your body is speaking to you right now? What
Yes.
part of your body protected you and now wants to be released?
Hmm.
And a lot of it you see it tied to inner child wounds,
Yes.
right? And so it's very beautiful to see,
Hmm.
and also being when clients come to that awareness of like, oh, I didn't realize it was tied to this wound that I've been
Mm.
carrying, right?
Yes.
So working through the messiness of all of that
Hmm.
can be very empowering because you start seeing kind of like a big relief of like, oh, it didn't come from me. It's
Yes.
not me. Something is wrong with me. This
Uh-huh.
comes from somewhere else. My
Absolutely.
body was protecting me, which is why I couldn't process it before.
Yes. And I think, also, if you've been given that message, like I think a lot of people of color, you just kind of ignore the pain, ignore the
Uh-huh.
whatever the feeling, because you've just got to keep going. You've got to keep achieving, or, whatever it is, like there needs to be that output, and we don't have time to discuss, that
Mm-hmm.
this doesn't really feel good to me, or that person doesn't make me feel
Mm-hmm.
comfortable. It's there's not a lot of space. So I really appreciate that you make that room for your clients to like learn themselves and understand, like, that feeling should be honored. That means something.
Absolutely.
Your body's telling you something.
Absolutely. And even kind of linking it to intergenerational trauma for
Hmm.
a lot of us, our parents perhaps also consistently operated on just kind of like go, 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 go.
Yeah, of
And
course.
being able to feel their emotions is something that they don't know how to do.
It's almost a
Right.
luxury, I
It,
think, for a lot of people, right?
absolutely. Absolutely. Because for a lot of them, perhaps they just had to survive.
Yes.
Right. And that meant like, I don't have time to lean into what's happening in my body. I just kind of
Hmm.
have to go. Or
Hmm.
even if I do, I don't have the option of like, let me process the emotion. Right. So a lot of the mindset, it was like that.
Yes.
Right. So now understanding of like, okay, now perhaps your parents were unable to teach you how to process emotions, how to express emotions.
Hmm.
Let's go back and pull in that 5-year-old girl, that 10-year-old
Yes.
girl. And what did how would it have looked like for her had
Mm.
she gotten the opportunity to process?
Uh,
And it's so beautiful to see because you see a lot of them going going back to their tapping into like inner childhood wounds and reparenting themselves in a way.
Yes.
And it's so beautiful to see, but also it's very layered because you see a lot of pain
Of
coming
course.
from.
Yes.
And so just trying to kind of having them understand how a lot of it is rooted from intergenerational trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, our parents perhaps didn't have the resources
Yes.
to and the awareness
Mm-hmm.
to process all of these emotions and understand what was happening because they were stuck on survival.
That's right. That's right.
Hmm.
And when you know, are stuck on survival, that's all that matters.
That's
If
all that
you can't
matters.
feed your kids, then really nothing else matters, right? If we're thinking
Absolutely.
about the hierarchy of needs, like then this isn't. It's not. If you unless you are safe and have a stable, situation, then the other
Right.
things you can't get to, right? I was wondering if you can talk to our listeners and explain a little bit more about inner child wounds and about reparenting, because I think that's something so valuable that we can learn how to do when we're talking about intergenerational trauma.
Absolutely. So inner child wounds, we think about just those wounds that happen in early childhood,
Mm-hmm.
right? That perhaps haven't been processed and are showing up as adults,
Mm-hmm.
right? And really understanding how those wounds have impacted you and also have supported your survival as
Mm.
as an adult,
Yes.
right? So kind of we talked about sexual abuse,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so kind of thinking about how navigating that as a child, kind of almost going back and finding out points where perhaps you needed someone to provide safety for you, not
Mm-hmm.
only physical safety but also emotional safety.
Yes.
How would that have felt if that 7-year old 10-year old would have received that safety,
Mm.
you know um and just being able to reparent that. So that means kind of pulling in resources that perhaps you wanted your parent to provide
Yes.
to you, but they didn't have the access or the resources to provide you
Mm-hmm.
those resources. What can you bring in for yourself? What tools would you
Yes.
give yourself right now if you would have had
Mm-hmm.
your parent there? So it's very
Yes.
beautiful to see where a lot of them say like, oh, I would have just want my mom to hug me.
Mm.
That's it. Or I would have want her just to say, hey, Mija, like, what's going on? Or
Yeah.
just kind of,
Just to
or just
ask.
pause and
Mm-hmm.
like, I see that you're not yourself today.
Yeah.
What's going on? Or when
Yes.
they share their story, when they disclose their story to just being validated and just
Yes.
kind of on how would that have felt? So it's just really kind of going back to that period
Mm-hmm.
and being able to process those emotions that have been cemented from that age,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it's very transformative when you see that because a lot of them are stuck in those ages
That's right.
developmentally, right, and
Yes.
emotionally, and
Mm-hmm.
you see that. And even we're talking about the cultural messages, right, is where we also begin to understand like, oh wow, this is something that I was taught and I'm releasing it because for so
Mm-hmm.
long I thought it was just me,
That's
something was
right.
wrong with me.
Yes.
And it's so beautiful to
Yeah.
to like detangle that.
I sometimes have had clients say to me, like, I just wanted someone to say, I believe you, or it's
Yes.
not your fault, right? And they know a lot of times people don't realize that they do, but they know what they needed in that
Hmm.
moment. And I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes, people say, I need to confront this person. I need to tell them what happened.
Hmm.
Like, okay, you can do that. Let's not get too attached to what you're hoping the outcome will be, because
Right.
maybe you're doing some work, but that person might not be doing the work too.
Uh-huh.
And you might not get the answer that you think you need. And so that's where like that reparenting comes in. Like you might have to do that for yourself.
Right.
Most likely you're going to have to do it for yourself. I think it's very
Absolutely.
rare that, you get that satisfactory response for someone and you feel healed. There's still work
Absolutely.
to do, Have you had
Yes.
that experience
Oh,
too with them?
absolutely.
Like I
Personally
need to write
and
this letter.
professionally, but absolutely. I do
Yes.
think that a lot of the times it's doing it for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because our parent may not be kind of emotionally
Mm-hmm.
capable of receiving that information,
Yes.
right? And they also maybe they're on a separate healing journey because I believe
Mm.
we're all in a healing journey.
Yes.
It just looks very different for
Mm-hmm.
all of us,
Mm-hmm.
whether we know it or we don't,
Yeah. Interesting.
and our parents, may perhaps not have the capacity,
Mm-hmm.
the emotional capacity to be able to listen, right?
Yes.
Or understand what you're
Mm-hmm.
saying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that if we stick to the kind of that hopefulness of like, okay, I just want my parents to apologize for not being there for me or whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
you may not get that. And if
Yes.
you don't receive that, how is that going to further
That's right.
impact you?
Yeah. How do you
Right?
continue on your
How do you
healing
continue
journey
to,
without
yeah.
that?
So then a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the times it's processing that is like, you can have this discussion with your parents, but just know that the outcome may not be what you hope for, kind of what you shared.
Yes.
And how do you feel about that? And do you feel like it invalidates now your work? And a lot of them like, no, it's my truth. And absolutely.
Yes.
It's still your truth. So just making sure that if you want to disclose that, you want to have those conversations that also know that it's for you.
Yes.
It's
Absolutely.
honoring
So
your journey, right? Or you may choose not to disclose that or have those conversations. And that's okay too. Because at the end of the day, we're going back to what works for you.
That's right.
And sometimes it's about like, I just need to let you know what I went through and how I felt. And that's it. And sometimes my clients will tell me like, I had this conversation. I feel like I needed to have this conversation with my parents. And I did, and they didn't say anything, but that was okay for me because all I needed was just them to listen. And I know that my truth is my truth. And it's okay if my parents, couldn't say anything or didn't either nor validate it or invalidate it, or, maybe they were just in shock with receiving that information.
Right. Yes.
Right. So sometimes it's just like, it's okay. Right. But understanding that you may not get the outcome that you're hoping for.
You can prepare for that and then decide if that's really what you need or not, and I also think it's very difficult probably when you have had, everyone's played a role in your family, and all of a sudden you come and you're like, I need to discuss this things, and like, well, no, we don't talk about that. And it happened to me. I'm fine. So you should be fine too. And we don't need to discuss it. Right. And that, that feeling of defensiveness, or when someone starts doing the work in their family, that can feel very threatening to everyone, right? Because if now you're confronting it, I need to confront my stuff too. I don't want to do that. That sounds terrible. How do you talk to clients about, knowing that their work is going to reverberate, maybe in great ways, but also it's going to be, everyone's not going to love it,
Yeah. I always talk about that too. Like sometimes like having like the burden of being the cycle breaker, right? Because, like you said, you may be the only one in your family system that is aware of the wounds that are happening here, right? And everyone else may not. And it's great in the sense that you're doing the work and you want to stop those patterns, right? At the same time, not everyone in the family system may be there, right? And when we invite those conversations, they're going to be heavy, right? Especially if you have a set of siblings where it's like, well, I didn't experience that, right?
Absolutely.
And just knowing that even though that may be the case, that it still doesn't invalidate your truth. And kind of also knowing the duality that there's multiple truths here, right? There's the truth that maybe your sibling perhaps may not experience that, but that doesn't invalidate your experience.
That's right.
Right? Because we all get a different set of parents, because so parents are also evolving and show up differently with every child.
Yes.
Right? So even leaning into that as well, right? And one of the things that I tell my clients, because they ask me like, oh, I want to be able to bring this awareness to my family or to my parents or to my siblings. I'm like, cool. Yes, that's great. And also understand that maybe the way that they receive it may impact them, or they may receive it very differently.
That's right.
And you need to be okay with that, right? Because they are in a different journey than you are, right? So sometimes we just want to, if you want to plant seeds, great. But sometimes that's as much as where we can go.
That's right.
And don't take on that burden now of wanting to make sure that you heal everyone in your family.
That's
because you have this knowledge now.
Well, and it almost makes you the parent, like you're almost being parentified again, right?
Absolutely. And now, exactly. That's exactly what I mean.
Now you're taking like ownership of everyone's healing, and in the same way, like you mentioned, like your eldest daughter, like first gen. So a lot of things where, there may be opportunities for people already. You could be parentified, or like you're expected to take care of other younger siblings or that kind of thing. And so I think that's so interesting of having to be aware of not going back into that role again, even with the best of intentions, right? But if you decide to take responsibility for everyone's healing, like you're not gonna be able to concentrate on your own, because as you said, everyone's going at their own pace. They're looking for different things, dealing with their own things that we might not even be aware of, although sometimes I have had clients and like, I've been in therapy all the time, and like, now finally my dad's in therapy, and like, that's amazing.
Right.
Don't get attached to, your dad being on the exact same path as you are, or wanting to take, responsibility for everything that you think that maybe he should. But that's great. You, as you said, you planted that seed, and now you said, okay, that's something I can do as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I tell my clients too, it's like you can always have these conversations from a place of curiosity, right? It's like, how was it for you when mom and dad were not always home,
Yes.
with your sibling, and see what comes up for them. And you may notice that it may be similar or may be different than your experience. Coming from a place of curiosity, I think it really invites of like this like non-judgmental way of having a conversation with our families, of like, okay, like how was that for you? And you can share your own experience, like this is how it was for me, right? And honoring multiple truths that are coexisting, right? And even with our parents too, when we want to understand like, where are these messages coming from, right? Even again, coming from a place of curiosity, like how was it for you, mom, dad, when you weren't when you didn't get something that you wanted from grandma, from grandpa? How did that look like for you? Or like how was it for you where if you had to work at a very young age, how were you disciplined? Discipline is something that comes up a lot in Latinx families, right? So
yes, same. Let's talk about that, because I do think that is an important like cultural nuance to be discussed without maybe saying this is wrong, this is right, but like this is what was, and then what is the impact it's had on me. So tell me how you talk to clients about that, because I think it's so important.
I a lot of the times I have these conversations that a lot of the cultural messages stem from colonization, right? So if we name that from the bat, right, it's like how did our ancestors learn to behave well? They were probably whipped. They were hit. So that is a message that has been passed from generation to generation. In order for me to get something, I must use physical force to probably get an outcome from that, right? So we think about how those messages were received of like, okay, I need to behave or else I'm going to get hit.
That's right.
Right. So I know for example, in my family, my mom was often beaten if she didn't kind of cooperate with my grandfather's rules, right? So now I come in, eldest daughter, right? My mom used the chancla or the sandal a lot, right? And that's how I was raised. I was disciplined if I didn't listen, right? And that's something that I see very often in our Latinx community, right? And for a long time, I think that I normalized it because it's just what we did, right? Like, oh yeah, I didn't listen, therefore I was gonna get the chancla.
Yeah, you knew what was gonna happen.
It was gonna happen, right? And it was so normalized, but through my own healing, what I realized is that there were moments where I wish my mom could have said like, hey, what happened here? What did you need from me in order for me to help you navigate this issue? Or just, I know there were times where I wish I would have been held, right? Or just kind of sat down and had this conversation of why my behavior was wrong, So just being able to understand how a lot of how that physical violence is often stems from intergenerational trauma, right? And how now with our future children's, we can have an end to that, right? We can stop that and be able to perhaps find different ways, alternative ways to discipline. Right?
It's so funny. It's making me think. So I got spankings as a kid with the belt. It was not good, and grounded too on top of that. But when I had my son, my husband and I had a conversation. We're like, okay. He's like, we're not going to spank. I'm like, we're not? Okay. Like, we're not going to spank, right? And it's funny because my mom like lives with us now, and she will say things like, oh, you guys sure talk to him a lot. I'm like, yeah, well, wait, this is something happened, so we're talking about it, and I want him to understand, like, I'm not pleased, but then I'm not going to use my, power if I'm telling you, for example, you have a little kid, hitting's bad, and I hit you. What is the actual message that you're getting? I'm asserting my power over you, and I'm telling you not to do that to other people. And so I think it's really made me think about that quite a bit. I used to lead this parenting class, and a lot of the parents were court ordered, and some of them, didn't have their children because there were issues of abuse and that kind of thing. We talk about spanking quite a bit. It was mostly people of color, and they're saying, I got spanked. What's the big deal? And some of them had experiences where they talked to a therapist, and therapist said, you'll lose your kids if you do that, without going into what you just explained, which is like, this is where it comes from. This was something that was used to keep people safe and alive, and it's not working for us now, or we don't need it in the same way. Like, what could we use instead? What are the tools that are available to us? And I think that your ability to just talk about where it comes from without just saying it's wrong, stop, is what makes the difference, right? That's what allows us to grow and evolve, you know? And so I just really appreciate that you take that time and make that extra step, because that's what's needed.
Absolutely. And I think it's important that, for me, that my clients understand that it's, also it is a generational behavior, right? And like you mentioned, perhaps it served us before to as a survival tool, right? To keep us in line,
Yes.
right? At the same time, it's no longer serving us because now we're seeing that we are carrying so many wounds as a result of that,
Yes.
right? And how do you want to change that for future generations to come, right? And so we definitely have a lot of those conversations too, because I also see parents who are first gen and have all these intersectional identities with them too, and those conversations definitely come up. And it's interesting that you mentioned that you have your parent also living in your household, because sometimes those are conversations that we have because of the generational differences of parenting, right?
Yes,
and
there
how
are
to
many.
navigate that, right? So we definitely have a lot of conversations of that, like how to navigate the generational differences when like now grandparents aren't involved in also parenting, and like how to have those conversations with grandparents about discipline and how that's going to look like. So it's very interesting because you see how now clients begin to kind of question, like, I remember this didn't feel good when it happened to me,
but you didn't even think you had a voice.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like,
thought.
but what can I do now?
Yes.
Yeah. So now and it's actually pretty nice to see, because now it's coming from them, like that question of like, I know I wanted something else, but I don't know how to go about it. And they being curious about how to like discipline their child. Like how can I have conversations with my 5-year-old, with my 10-year-old, with my teen about this? And I really wanted my parents to talk to me about it, but instead I got spanked. I got the chancla. There was no conversations happening. But like, how can I have these conversations with my child? Because I don't want to spank her, or I don't want to like use a chancla, So it's actually really beautiful to see how they kind of comes from them and wanting to like break that cycle and want to have a healthier relationship with their children.
Yes. And you can see, as you get to be an adult, you can see like your parents as people and not just as your parents, right? And so I think, not to make excuses if you've had, a terrible experience, but to understand, like you said, like coming from that place of curiosity. And it makes me think of a conversation that I had with my mom one of the times where she was just like, oh, you sure talk to him a lot. Like there's no spanking happening in this house, but a lot of chatting. And we were discussing that, and she was saying, well, for your father and I, like when we got married, we said the thing we're going to do that's different is we are going to tell our kids we love them all the time. Like we knew our parents, for them, they said we knew our parents loved us because they kept a house over their, a roof over their heads. They fed them. So they knew they were loved, but it wasn't said. And that was their thing that they were going to add. And we're going to say, I love you all the time. Like we never hung up the phone, never left. Even if someone wasn't happy with someone else, we always said, I love you. And so that's something that I do. Like my son might think I'm a little too affectionate, but I think that's something that is a lovely kind of thing to bring in. And for them, that they felt like that was revolutionary, right? That we're going to do this. And I don't know anyone else who's doing this, but we're going to make this a thing in our family. And so I think, as you get to be older, you kind of had that opportunity to be like, maybe they were doing the best that they could. And the best it wasn't great. Right. It wasn't great. It didn't feel good. But now I can see what I need to do and where my healing is and what the things that I want to bring forward and the things that we can leave in the past.
Absolutely. And I think that brings me to this aspect when we speak of intergenerational healing, because as much as trauma can be passed down, also healing. Right.
Yes.
So seeing this aspect of like even, where you mentioned that your parents wanted to pass the I love yous, right? And perhaps that is something that you also bring in with your children, right? How beautiful is that, right? So recognizing that where there were messages perhaps that you want to leave behind, but also there's beautiful parts that come from this that you also want to take with you and continue to cultivate, right? And that's one of the things that I work with my clients too, is like not only recognizing the cultural messages, the burdens that have been passed down, but also what gifts, have been passed down that you want to continue in your legacy, in your future legacies, right? And being able to hone in on that. And I think that also offers opportunity for compassion and grace for our parents and our grandparents, right? Knowing that is like, you know what, they perhaps did not have the resources, that we do. And they did the best they could. And they also provided perhaps their way of showing love was through acts of service, right?
Yes.
And
cooking an amazing meal.
Cooking an amazing
that means
meal.
I'm sorry.
Exactly. Absolutely. Or being able to make sure that on your first day of school, you always have like a, fresh pair of of shoes, or like you always look good because that meant something for you, or whatever it may be, right? Just even looking at different things that could have passed down, that you're like, you know what, I think that there were moments where my parents showed me that they loved me. Perfect. How can we continue to cultivate that? And you can use that to also help you enhance your relationship with your children, and also seeing that. And I think that's very beautiful because it allows this opportunity of compassion and grace for our parents. And when we work through intergenerational trauma lenses, oftentimes we can get stuck on like just seeing the wounds that have been passed down. But also recognizing where these come from and what also gifts have been passed down, and I think that's when we start to see, wow, okay, like this experience is very nuanced and it's okay.
Yes. So tell me, because, you are a bicultural therapist and culturally informed, how do you then approach those kinds of things differently? Do you think with your clients, knowing that you understand those nuances, that you understand the layers in a different way, or have experienced them personally? How do you think that impacts you as a professional?
Yeah, in so many ways. I think one way, I think it allows me the opportunity to connect with my clients in a way that I know that it was difficult sometimes for me to connect with certain therapists who perhaps had a difficulty understanding my cultural background. But I think it allows me to understand, but also recognizing that even though we may have different cultural similarities, that it is not necessarily monolith, and that we have everything is the exact same, right? But I think that it definitely offers that ability to understand and perhaps also again coming like visibility and representation in the therapy space, right?
So
because sometimes if we don't see someone that look like us, we don't think it's for us, right? So even in the therapy space, like knowing that is like, oh, you're Latina, you're a child of immigrants, perhaps being able to understand those complex layers and how that impacts their mental health, right? And another part too is being bilingual. I often tend to code switch and I speak Spanglish, and a lot of my clients understand and contextualize, through Spanglish, speaking Spanish and English. So that's also very cool to have that affirmed in the therapeutic space, right? That we can have this kind of dancing around in language, and I understand what you mean. So that's also like really, really nice. And also as we're working through different layers of their trauma, also being able to honor that, the experiences of our parents, and in a way that is non-judgmental, right? And being able to honor, those ancestral gifts that are being passed down, right? And what does that mean? Because oftentimes in therapeutic space, it could look very westernized, right? Everything is over pathologized.
It really is.
Everything is over pathologized. And sometimes it's like, no, it makes sense. It makes sense if we add like those cultural lenses, right? Of like, this is how, your family learned to survive. And it makes sense.
Absolutely.
What oppressive systems are dancing around here that have also impacted you? We name that into the therapeutic space too. We're not going to say you're just anxiety, you're experiencing depression. Is that, where does that come from? It's like, if that is the case, we have to give you a diagnosis for insurance purposes.
Sometimes you do, yes.
We at least want to understand that. We understand where it's coming from. So you're just not walking around thinking like, I'm anxious, or like I am depressed. I am my diagnosis, because that's not what we do here.
Right. And I think too, as I've told you, that's like one of the reasons I wanted to go into international psychology, because I felt like it was so pathologizing, and also all these kinds of things haven't even been tested on people like us anyway.
That
people of
part.
color, let alone like women. Like, no. So this doesn't apply to us. And I was seeing that with my clients too, a lot. And before, when I was getting my hours training, I worked at a place that did not diagnose, because for that reason, like, we're not trying to put you in this box, and then what do you do with that information now? I told you you're anxious. They're like, okay, I'm still anxious. So now what does that mean? Or where does that come from, right? Like, it doesn't answer the full question of like who I am and how I got here.
Right.
And so I think it's so helpful that even in the times when you do have to diagnose, it's like, we're talking about, I'm not just now putting you under this umbrella of this is what you are. We have to do it for this part of, society, but that doesn't mean that now we've solved the puzzle and like we can move on now. And I think that having someone like you, who maybe, as you said, it's not that everyone, like, it's a monolithic kind of situation for all of your clients. And I think sometimes people can often feel like there's still a shorthand that's really valuable. I've had clients say like, I was looking for a Black woman and I found you. And I was like, okay, that's great. What does that mean to you?
Yes.
Right. What do you are expecting to like then receive from me? Right. And a lot of times they're right. I understand. And I'm sure you see this with your clients. Stigma. If you tell me you don't want to tell your parents that you're in therapy, I'm not going to be like, why? I can't. You should tell them. No, I understand why you're saying that, and maybe we'll get to that and maybe we won't. But you know what I mean? There's a little bit of a shorthand there. And so I think that even something like you were mentioning about with the parents, like that they're doing the best that they can and that kind of thing. I think sometimes that is just the kind of language and conversation people need to have, because we're also taught to be loyal, right? And so now I go to therapy and I'm going to tell this stranger like the problems in my family. Like, that's not, I've had all these messages that that's not okay. And so I think even by you understanding how to approach that we're not saying it to say this person is to blame for every bad thing that's happened in your life, but what happened, what happened when you were growing up, maybe understanding more like what happened to them and then what to do with it. It just kind of gives people that space to be like, okay, I can let go of that part of why I didn't want to go into therapy. I can let go of that part of the stigma,
Absolutely. And I think understanding, like with that, like a lot of the baggage that comes with the cultural burdens, and being able to know how to understand, but also maneuver that, because again, we're complex human beings, and for some of us, especially as people of color, we have complex identities too. So just being able to understand a little bit about like who you are, where does that come from, right, and how to move forward, right, and a lot of it is breaking the stigma of even just coming to therapy, right. And one of the things too that I always kind of tell my clients too, it's like therapy is one way of healing, right? There's multiple ways that an individual can heal, right? Because I also don't want to weaponize kind of therapy and just be like, that is the only way that we can heal, right?
So
because
important.
oftentimes in Western psychology, that's been the message, right? And as someone who does her best to connect with my ancestors and their gifts, I honor that with my clients. And sometimes they're like, oh, I went with like a healer, or I did this, I did that, or holistic ways of healing. And that's wonderful. We can do that alongside with therapy, right? And so just really honoring also that there's multiple ways of healing, especially when we're doing a lot of intergenerational trauma. And especially with a lot of trauma it's rooted in historical trauma based on our ancestors, a lot of colonial violence, sometimes through doing it through ways of holistic, of medicine is something that can be very powerful.
Absolutely. Yes. I love that. I think that is so important, that this is a tool, but it's not the only one available to you. And if I'm telling you, as I think the way that you practice as well with my clients, like, you are the expert on your life. I see you once a week, 45 minutes, 50 minutes. And the rest of the time you have already learned how to like navigate the space around you. You know what you need, right? And so everyone doesn't respond to the one-on-one kind of talk therapy. And that might not be for you, or maybe it's used in conjunction with other things, or maybe at different points in your life you need different things, right? And I think that it's such a beautiful point that you made, because if we say this is the way, then we're part of the problem of like of that hierarchy of like Western psychology, right? Like that's not a thing for everyone. And people have survived.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of cultures survived without it and
Right.
thrived. And so what are the other tools, that are important to you? Like, what do you need in your life right now? And bring in all the ones that work for you, and the ones that don't, again, if you're the expert on your life, then that's not for you.
Yes.
I think that it's so valuable and empowering to also get that message, especially if you feel that you have been like overlooked, or like your experience invalidated in a lot part of your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think it also allows them to connect to their ancestry in ways that perhaps in therapy it may be a little bit differently. And that's also really nice to see when clients want to tap into other holistic ways of healing. In Latinx families, or in our culture, we use a lot of kind of limpias, which are kind of like natural herbs, just kind of doing a cleansing, right? And a lot of that, individuals have mentioned, like, I feel there's a release, that has come from that. And then knowing that their parents also did it, their grandparents have also done it. Personally, I come from a lineage of healers, so which I think for me, when someone is able to name that in a therapeutic setting, I found that very validating, because for a long time I felt like I could not share. There's only one way of kind of navigating, misunderstood, or just one way of kind of navigating mental health, right? So then when that was brought into the therapeutic space, I was like, oh yes, this is something that I can talk about,
right? And this is a big part of
and
you,
this is a big
right?
part
that
of
you've
me.
been keeping, to yourself, because you didn't.
Absolutely.
Maybe, and that was the experience that people were not,
absolutely. And then now I have clients who say like, oh my God, like I had this horrible experience and I haven't been feeling well. Let's chop it up here in therapy. And they're like, I went with like my local healer and got a limpia, I got a cleansing. So it's beautiful to see. And like, now I feel better. Like, let me process it some more here.
And how valuable for them to have you, who's not gonna be like, well, what's that? Or why do you need that? You're like, I get it. That's great that you're able to do that. I think it reminds me, like, back of what you're saying of when we're talking about intergenerational trauma, like how important it is to not get stuck on the trauma, but also like, what are the gifts? Because even sometimes you're learning what you don't want, and that's still a gift that can be used to help you grow and progress, and bring those things forward. So I think it's so important that we don't talk about solely like the burdens and the traumas, but also, like the beauty and the joy and like the uniqueness and like, specialness of, all of the gifts and everything that we have.
And I think that's, you tapped into this aspect of joy, right? And that's one of the things that I really hone in as we're kind of speaking, like, well, how do we heal from intergenerational trauma, right? And that one of the things that I cultivate with my clients is like, how does joy look like for you? Because for many of them, maybe they have never experienced joy, or maybe especially as a child, right? How does that look like? Sometimes we have to heal our inner child. Perhaps we have to do childlike joy.
You have to give yourself permission.
Give yourself permission to do that, right? And notice how your body is receptive to that and it's receiving that. And a lot of them, will tell me, it's like, you know what, I went ice skating, or I was drawing, and I found myself feeling like my 10-year-old self, and so even cultivating joy in a way that really speaks to you, I think it's really amazing, and also can support you in your healing, of intergenerational patterns, right? And so really, I that's one of the things that I always like to honor, with my clients. It's like, how does joy look like for you?
Right.
And how can we continue to cultivate that and enhance that?
And for people who are like listening, who are kind of struggling with that, what kind of suggestions would you give? As like, how do you find things that might bring you joy? If you were like, I don't know the last time I felt joyful, I don't know what that would look like. What kind of suggestions do you give people?
So the first thing I would definitely say is notice things that are feeling kind of that are making your body have a different type of response. And oftentimes we spend so much time just noticing feelings that are uncomfortable or any discomfort, right? A lot of tension. So we are experts of like noticing that, right? Now let's retrain our bodies and like, how can we notice maybe even like the glimpses of the sun that you're like, oh, this feels so good. How does this feel in my body? Or, being able to, if you're if you tend to kind of stay indoors, how does it feel just stepping outside? Or if you interact with someone that it's really providing you that physical and emotional safety, how does that feel in your body? So even just baby steps of like really, again, reclaiming this aspect of your body, regulating your nervous system. How does that feel? Because many of us, we don't know how that feels. And in that, we're going to learn, oh, this actually elicits perhaps maybe not joy yet, but this elicits something that makes me feel good. And I want to continue to enhance that. Maybe this means I need to spend more time with this person, because I feel physically and emotionally safe with this person. Or maybe, every time I go outside and go on a walk, it makes me feel good. Maybe I need to do that a little bit more, right? So just very gentle things. We don't always have to go ice skating or go rollerblading or, or anything, go to Disneyland or anything like that. But, things that we can do on our day to day to just really honor, that we do have the capacity to feel joy, right? But that may take some time if you've never felt it. It's okay. And it's okay because we are doing it through baby steps. And right now, the best thing is like, get to know your body responses and acknowledge when you're feeling something that feels good. And hone in on that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a muscle, right? That needs to be worked.
Absolutely.
and it probably feels strange for people to think of it that way. But, to your point, when you're saying you've never had the opportunity or luxury to think about what makes you feel joyful, and now like you're giving people that space and helping them practice that so that they can bring that into their lives in a different way. That's really powerful. Dr. Hernandez, it's been amazing speaking with you. I've learned so much. Thank you for sharing. If people want to find out more about where you are and your work, where can they find you?
Absolutely. So my website, bailantetherapy.com, and then also I'm on Instagram. I do a lot of social media content, and especially with destigmatizing mental health and BIPOC communities, Latinx families at Bailante Therapy.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm Dr. Patrice Lagoy. You can find me on drpatricelagoy.com and in social media at Therapy with Dr. Patrice. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next episode.